President Trump will soon make a statement on the Syria conflict. A short time ago, he tweeted claiming success in Syria, despite bipartisan backlash and global condemnation to his decision to pull troops from the region. The president also claims the Kurds are safe after Turkey invaded northern Syria and launched a military offensive against the group. His own ambassador says hundreds have already been killed. So we're going to bring you the latest on President Trump's remarks at 11 a.m. Eastern once they begin. And this comes as the U.S. loses influence in the region while Russia makes some major gains. Russian and Turkish leaders have reached a deal to divvy up the land Turkey just took from the Kurds after the U.S. abandoned them. America's envoy to Syria estimates hundreds of Kurds have already been killed since Turkey was allowed to invade. And this comes as Defense Secretary Mark Esper makes his way through Iraq today. Esper said U.S. troops would stay near Syria to monitor the situation, but Iraq's military chief says that's not happening. U.S. troops that withdrew from northern Syria will now leave Iraq within 4 weeks. Holly Williams is in the region with the latest.
Just 3 weeks ago, Kurdish-led forces allied with the US were in control of this territory here in northeastern Syria. Now Turkey is in control. This is the Turkish military, Turkish soldiers. We came across the border with them this morning. It has been a tumultuous time. Earlier this month, President Trump ordered US troops to pull back from the Turkey-Syria border. American forces are now withdrawing from eastern Syria. Following that, Turkey launched an offensive into northeastern Syria, targeting those Kurdish forces that were partnered with the US in the fight against ISIS. But Turkey regards them as a terrorist organization. Last night, we saw Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Russian President Vladimir Putin making a deal about the future of this part of Syria. They agreed on a ceasefire. Turkey will get a nearly 20-mile deep safe zone along its border, and Turkish soldiers will carry out joint patrols with Russian troops. We've already seen Russian troops moving into areas that were controlled by Kurdish forces backed by the US. All of this is a powerful illustration of how the US is ceding influence here in the Middle East to Russia. Now, those Kurdish-led forces say that they are still holding around 12,000 accused ISIS fighters, including 4,500 foreigners. And one big question going forward is who will take control of those prisons? Who will stop a mass prison break? Who will prevent ISIS reforming its army of militants?
So CBS News State Department and Foreign Affairs reporter Christina Ruffini is following the story from Washington. So glad you're here. So, Christina, how significant is this deal between Russia and Turkey, and what's likely to happen here?
Well, it's significant because it is between Turkey and Russia and not the U.S. The U.S. withdrawal from northeast Syria, the border will now be patrolled by a combination of Russian and Syrian forces. And this deadline is hit, which means that Kurdish YPG forces have to get out of the areas controlled by the Turks. A senior administration official told us yesterday that if the Turks find them within the territory after this ceasefire, or pause is what the Turks are insisting it be called, that the Turks will either let the U.S. know where the YPG forces are or they will shoot them. Basically, Syria's fate and the fate of the Kurdish groups that fought alongside the U.S. to defeat ISIS within Syria will now be determined by Turkey, Russia, and the Syrian government forces of Bashar al-Assad. The U.S. has ceded all control and is pretty much sitting on the sidelines, or in this case, the other side of the Iraqi border, watching it all play out.
So it has occurred to me that the two groups that we are talking about, Russia and Turkey, are groups that do not reside in this area. We haven't talked about whether the Kurds were involved in this deal in any way. And I know you mentioned Bashar al-Assad, and perhaps Russia is speaking on behalf of the interests of Syria, but I don't hear Syria involved in this deal either.
No, this was a bilateral agreement between these two proxy forces, the Turks and Russia. The Kurds were not involved in the deal. The Kurdish leader, General Mazloum, said yesterday he wrote a letter to the vice president that said his forces has held up their end of the agreement the U.S. made with Turkey that these groups were also not involved in, and he had evacuated most, if not all, of the YPG fighters out of that safe zone area before the end of the deadline. Officials said yesterday they believed that mostly had been accomplished, but the U.S. admitted it doesn't have as much visibility into into that area to see if it had actually happened, because their troops have moved out and they're left without eyes on the ground. Turkey has made no secret of the fact that it doesn't want these groups, these YPG, SDF forces on their border. They essentially want to move them out and replace them with different Syrian refugees, largely Muslim refugees, robbing the Kurds of what has been their ancestral homeland and this semi-autonomous and peaceful region they had carved out.
And so, I guess it's probably hard to say, but I mean, what happens to the Kurds? Where do they move to? I mean, it just seems that there is no one sort of negotiating on their behalf here at all.
It's unclear, and it's especially odd considering how much territory they had controlled and how big of partners they had been in the U.S. fight against ISIS. The problem is they just could, they could handle the fight against ISIS because it was an insurgency and it was kind of equal footing, but they can't fight the Turkish army and they can't fight the Russian army. So now that the U.S. has left, they're basically caught in the middle, and they're going to get squeezed from the north by Turkey and from the south by the Syrians and the Russians, and it's very unclear where they are supposed to go.
So here's another thing that I found sort of odd and unclear. So at first we had heard that the troops were being pulled out of Syria, and then we heard, well, they're not being pulled completely out of the region. They're going to go to Iraq. And now we're hearing from the military department in Iraq that, well, U.S. troops actually don't have permission to stay there forever. What is going on? And what does this say about America's role in the region, that this option to go to Iraq had not been finalized?
It talks about the urgency of when these decisions are made and how they're made. This is hip check diplomacy. They're not going through a deliberative process. This is something the president is deciding and making. It also talks about the fact that, as we said earlier, the U.S. is ceding authority in this region to, above all people, the Russians. American officials have said a few times now, as far as with the Turks, that this is Pottery Barn rules, right? If you break it, you bought it, and Turkey breaks it, they're going to have to deal with the aftermath. But the aftermath could be the resurgence of ISIS and the destabilization of an entire area of the Middle East. And that's going to impact everyone, including Europe and the U.S. Also, this Pottery Barn analogy is deeply flawed, because it's not like the Turks are going into the store, breaking a lamp, and offering to pay for it. They're essentially going into the strip mall, getting rid of Pottery Barn, replacing it with a store they like better, and telling all of its employees if they ever come back, they're going to kill them.
Much better analogy. While everyone was sort of concerned about the inquiry into the impeachment, President Trump's envoy to Syria was testifying yesterday before Congress. Senators questioned him on Turkey's military offensive against the Kurds, and remarkably, he says that no one consulted him about withdrawing troops from northern Syria. I want to play a little bit of what he had to say.
Were you consulted before the decision was made to withdraw our troops?
I was consulted on the framework of that call, the points that the president was going to make and such. The specific decision to withdraw troops has been a long-standing debate within the administration going back to early 2018.
But were you advised about the decision to withdraw all of our troops following that Erdogan call?
That specific decision, I was not in advance.
What are we to make of this? What does this say about the Trump administration's foreign policy strategy?
It says there isn't much of a strategy. Jim Jeffrey did his best to defend the president, say these are decisions the president has to make, and that Secretary Pompeo knew the consequences of this decision without speaking to him about it, because all these players had the exact same discussion in December when Turkey threatened to do this the first time around. But as we talked about, this is in the moment hip check diplomacy, and sometimes that can work, but normally it doesn't, especially when you have a very complicated geopolitical situation with this many proxy players, including Russia, Iran, Syria, and Turkey, 3 out of the 4 of which are not friends of the U.S., but which essentially just got given a big gift by the U.S. pulling out of Syria.
All right, Christina, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Anne Marie.